Step out of the gray and into a vivid reality where every emotion is heightened and every color tells its own story. Our cinematic visuals bring a new level of intensity to the narratives you love and the characters you follow. Click subscribe now for a more vivid experience today. The morning my son-in-law asked me to water his plants while they were away for the long weekend, I thought nothing of it. I was just being helpful, the way I'd always been. That was my nature. That had always been my nature. 67 years of life, and I still hadn't learned that not everyone deserves your help. Not everyone who smiles at you across the dinner table actually wishes you well. I remember standing in their kitchen that Saturday morning, watering can in hand, sunlight coming through the window above the sink, and thinking to myself that maybe things were finally settling down. My wife had been gone 3 years by then. 3 years of learning how to make coffee for one, how to sit in a quiet house without it swallowing you whole. My daughter and her husband had been a comfort through all of it, or so I believed. They had me over for Sunday dinners. My son-in-law would call during the week just to check in, ask how I was sleeping, whether I needed anything. I told my old friend at the golf club that I was one of the lucky ones. A lot of men my age, they lose their wives, and then they lose their families too, one way or another. Not me, I said. I've still got them. I set down the watering can on the counter and noticed my son-in-law's laptop sitting open on the kitchen table. The screen hadn't gone dark yet. I wasn't snooping. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters to me even now. I was walking past, and the screen was right there, and a name caught my eye. My name, my full name, the kind of thing your brain registers before you even decide to look. I stopped. I told myself not to. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a birthday reminder. Maybe something my daughter had written about planning a surprise. I stood there in the kitchen of their house, holding my breath without realizing it, and I looked at the screen. It was an email. The inbox was open. The subject line of the topmost message said, Timeline for the transfer confirming the policy details. I don't know how long I stood there. The refrigerator hummed. A car went by outside on the street. I set the watering can down very slowly, the way you move when you don't want to startle something dangerous. And I leaned in and read. I won't pretend I understood everything in that first reading. Parts of it were in language I didn't know, financial jargon that blurred together. But some parts were perfectly clear. My name, my insurance policy number, which I recognized, because I have a memory for numbers, always have. A dollar figure with so many zeros that my vision went strange for a moment. And a line near the bottom of the email, written by my son-in-law to someone I didn't recognize, that said, The old man's health isn't great and he's been more isolated since she died. I don't think it'll take long. I stepped back from the table. My first instinct was to call my daughter. My second instinct, arriving less than a second after, was to do absolutely nothing of the sort. Because whoever was on the other end of that email thread, my son-in-law had been writing to them about me, about my health, about my isolation, about how long it would take. I took a photograph of the screen with my phone. My hands were steadier than I expected. I have always been a practical man, an engineer by trade, 32 years at the same firm before I retired, and something in my training kicked in right then. Document first, fall apart later. I finished watering the plants. I locked up the house. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel for a long time before I started the engine. The drive home took 20 minutes. I made myself wait until I was inside before I looked at the photograph again. I sat at my own kitchen table, the one my wife and I had bought together at a place up near Bob Cajun 20 years ago, and I read the email a second time, and then a third. I don't think it'll take long. I called my accountant the next morning. He had been handling my finances since before my daughter was born. One of those relationships you don't fully appreciate until you need it. I told him I needed to come in. I told him it was urgent. He heard something in my voice that made him say he could fit me in that same afternoon. His office was on the main street in town, above the old pharmacy, the kind of place that smells like wood polish and hasn't changed much since the 80s. I sat across from him and I showed him the photograph of the email on my phone. I watched his face change as he read it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, How long has your son-in-law had access to your financial information? The question hit me like a door swinging open into a cold room. I thought about it. I thought about how, after my wife passed, my son-in-law had offered to help me organize her accounts, close things out, deal with the paperwork. I had been grateful. I had been so grateful. I thought about how he had come with me to meet with the insurance company when I updated my beneficiaries. I thought about how he always seemed to know when money was moving, how he'd ask casual questions about my retirement fund, my investments, what I planned to do with the house eventually. I thought I had been sharing information with family. I had not understood that I was being inventoried. My accountant pulled up my accounts on his computer. He was quiet while he looked through them, clicking through screens, and then he swiveled the monitor toward me and pointed at a date 3 months earlier. There had been a call to the investment firm. Whoever called had provided my date of birth, my postal code, and the last 4 digits of my social insurance number. They had asked about the process for transferring assets in the event of the account holder's death. They had asked about the specific payout timeline. The call had not come from my number. My accountant pulled his glasses down and rubbed his eyes. He said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't go home and confront anyone. Don't call your daughter. Don't tip him off. What you need to do right now, today, is call a lawyer." He gave me the name of someone he trusted. I was in that lawyer's office 2 hours later. The lawyer was a woman about my age, sharp and direct, the kind of person who doesn't waste words. I sat across from her and told her everything. The email, the call to the investment firm, the way my son-in-law had slowly worked himself into every corner of my financial life over the past 3 years. As I talked, I started hearing the pattern in my own words, the shape of it, and it made me feel sick in a way I hadn't felt since the hospital called about my wife. She told me the first thing I needed to do was protect the assets. Change the passwords on every account. Notify the investment firm and the insurance company that no inquiries were to be accepted from anyone other than me, in person, with identification. She would handle the paperwork for a new power of attorney, one that named someone outside the family. She told me to get a safety deposit box at a bank across town and put all my important documents in it. Then she said, "The email you photographed. We need more than that. We need to understand the full scope of what he's been planning." I drove home that evening, and I sat in my living room in the dark for a long time. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the Sunday dinners and the check-in calls and all the small kindnesses that had kept me afloat after my wife died. I thought about whether my daughter knew. I thought about whether she was a part of it. I didn't want to believe it. I chose, in that moment, not to believe it. Not because I was naive, but because I needed to find out for certain before I burned everything down. A retired colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with for years at the firm, had moved into private investigations after he left engineering. I know that sounds unusual. He had always been like that, restless, curious, the kind of man who needed a problem to solve. I called him that night. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "Okay, give me a week." What he found in that week I am still not entirely prepared to describe in full. My son-in-law had not been working at the firm he told everyone he worked at for the past 14 months. He had left, or been let go, and had been collecting severance while telling my daughter, telling me, telling everyone that everything was fine. He had been burning through their savings. He had taken out a line of credit against the equity in their house, my daughter's house, the down payment for which I had provided, and that line of credit was nearly maxed out. And then there was the life insurance policy. 3 years earlier, shortly after my wife's funeral, my son-in-law had accompanied me to update my beneficiaries, as I mentioned. What I had not known, what I had no reason to check, was that at some point in the year following that meeting, someone had contacted the insurance company and requested additional documentation about a supplementary policy I had not known existed. My wife and I had taken out a joint policy decades ago, one of those things you do when you're young and starting out, and when she died, the payout had gone into an account I had essentially forgotten about. It turned out my son-in-law had not forgotten about it. He had been tracking it, and he had made inquiries, not yet successful ones, but inquiries about whether that account could be redirected in the event of my death before I had formally addressed it in my will. My colleague also found the second email address. My son-in-law had a personal email account that was not the one my daughter knew about. He had been corresponding through this account with a woman in another city. The nature of the correspondence made clear that this relationship had been ongoing for at least 2 years. The financial discussions in those emails were not vague. They were specific. They referenced me by name. They referenced a figure, the total of my assets, surprisingly accurately calculated, and they referenced what my son-in-law described, in his own words, as waiting for the situation to resolve itself naturally, or helping it along if necessary. Helping it along if necessary. I read those words on my colleague's printout, and I had to put the paper down and walk to the window. Outside, the street was completely ordinary. A neighbor walking a dog, a kid on a bicycle, the sky going pink at the edges with early evening. Everything exactly as it had always been, and me standing there holding the knowledge that the man who called me on weekdays to ask how I was sleeping had been discussing, in writing, whether to help my death along if it wasn't coming fast enough on its own. I called my lawyer. Then I called the police. The detective who came to my lawyer's office was younger than I expected. Quiet, methodical. She listened to everything. She looked at the emails, the financial records, the insurance inquiry documentation. She asked me several questions, none of which I will repeat here, because the investigation was still active at that point. At the end of the meeting, she said, "You did the right thing coming to us with this much documentation. A lot of people come to us too early, and we can't do anything. You waited, you built a record, and that's going to matter." I had not thought of it as waiting. I had thought of it as falling apart slowly in private while trying to do the practical things. But I'll take it. Here's what I want to tell you, and I want to say it plainly before I go any further, because I know some of you listening to this have your own complicated feelings about family, about loyalty, about what it means to keep the peace. I know because I used to be the same way. My wife used to tease me about it. She'd say I could see the good in a stone wall if I looked long enough. But there is no version of this story where staying quiet would have been kindness. There is no version where protecting him would have protected anyone who mattered. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop pretending. My daughter did not know about the second email address. She did not know about the financial scheme in the way her husband knew about it, with cold, deliberate planning. What she knew, and what came out slowly, painfully, over many conversations in the weeks that followed, was that she had felt something was wrong for a long time, and had told herself it was her anxiety, her tendency to imagine problems. She had been gaslit so thoroughly and so gently that she had stopped trusting her own instincts. When I told her what we had found, she sat at my kitchen table, the Bobcaygeon table, the one her mother and I had carried up 3 flights of stairs on a rainy Saturday in August, and she didn't say anything for so long that I started to get frightened. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong." I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. I put my hand over hers, and I didn't say anything either. There wasn't anything to say. Sometimes the hardest thing to forgive is not what someone did to you, but what they made you doubt about yourself. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. My son-in-law was taken from their house while my daughter was at work, which was by design. The detective had been considerate about that, more considerate than I had expected. I was not there. I had asked not to be. There are moments that belong to other people's grief, and I didn't want to insert myself into one, but I was told, later, what happened at the station. I was told that my son-in-law, when presented with the financial records and the emails and the insurance documentation, had not broken down the way you might imagine from television. He had been very still. He had asked for his lawyer. And then, before his lawyer arrived, he had said one thing that the detective later shared with me because she thought I should know. He had said he was always going to leave everything to her anyway. I was just tired of waiting. He had been waiting. All those Sunday dinners, all those phone calls, all that performed concern, he had been sitting across from me and waiting. And I had topped up his coffee and passed him the maple syrup and told my friend at the golf club that I was one of the lucky ones. The trial, I won't go through in exhaustive detail, partly because my lawyer advised a certain discretion until sentencing, partly because some of it is still painful in ways I haven't fully sorted out. What I will tell you is that the evidence was substantial enough that his defense had very little room to maneuver. The second email address, the financial inquiries, the correspondence with the woman in the other city, all of it was documented, time-stamped, traceable. My colleague's work, my accountant's records, my lawyer's preparation, 3 years of trust being exploited, and then about 3 weeks of very careful, very deliberate dismantling of the lie. There was a moment in the courtroom that I keep returning to. His lawyer was arguing something about intent, about the difference between planning and action, about how nothing had actually happened to me, as though proximity to harm without the completion of it was somehow neutral. And my son-in-law turned and looked at me from across the room. I have thought about that look many times since. It was not remorseful. It was not pleading. It was something else. Something I find difficult to name. A kind of blankness that was somehow worse than anger would have been. I looked back at him. I didn't look away. The judge sentenced him to 4 years. The fraud charges, the financial crimes, the documented evidence of intent, it added up. He will serve that time. The woman he had been corresponding with was also charged with fraud-related offenses, though that process is ongoing and I don't have full details. My son-in-law's lawyer, in his closing remarks, said something about his client's difficult financial circumstances, about pressure and desperation, and I understood, in an abstract way, that desperation is real and that people do things under pressure they would not otherwise do. I understood that, but I also thought about my wife. I thought about the last 2 years of her life, how she fought so hard and hurt so much, and how the thing she worried about most, near the end, was whether I would be all right on my own. She made me promise I would let people take care of me. She made me promise I wouldn't become one of those men who disappears into himself after. I had tried to honor that. I had opened my door and my table and my trust, because she asked me to, because I loved her, because it was the right thing to do. And he had looked at all of that and seen an opportunity. No, desperation doesn't cover it. Not for me. Not from where I'm standing. My daughter filed for divorce. That process has been its own kind of hard, separate from everything else, and I try to stay available to her without being in the way. She is stronger than she knows. She gets that from her mother, and I tell her so when she needs to hear it. We have Sunday dinners again, just the two of us now, and we don't talk about him more than we have to. We talk about other things. We have started to learn each other in a different way. The way parents and adult children sometimes don't get the chance to until something strips away the buffer of routine. As for me, I changed everything my lawyer told me to change. New accounts, new passwords, a proper, airtight will drafted by a firm with no connection to anyone in the story I just told you. I have a safety deposit box, and I know where the key is, and no one else does. I am not suspicious of everyone. I refuse to become that person. Refuse to let him turn me into someone who can't accept a kindness without calculating the angle. But I am done confusing helpfulness with trust. Done confusing closeness with safety. They are not the same thing. I know that now in a way that cost more than I would have chosen to pay for the lesson. I still go to the golf club on Thursdays. I still have a friend there, the one I once told I was one of the lucky ones. I told him the whole story eventually, sitting on the patio after 9 holes with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. He listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know, I always thought there was something off about him. The way he'd ask about your finances like it was just conversation." I said, "You never told me that." He said, "You seemed happy. I didn't want to be the one." I've thought about that a lot. How much goes unsaid between people who love each other because we don't want to be the one. I'm not saying he was wrong. I don't know what I would have done with the information back then, whether I would have heard it or found a way to dismiss it, the way my daughter had dismissed her own instincts for years. Maybe some knowledge has to arrive the way mine did, through a laptop screen on a Saturday morning with the sunlight coming through the window, when you're just trying to water someone's plants. Last August, my daughter and I drove up to Bobcaygeon. We rented a small cabin by the water for a long weekend. We swam, which I hadn't done in years, and we cooked on a propane barbecue that took us 45 minutes to figure out, and in the evenings we sat on the dock and watched the light change on the water. I don't have the words for what it felt like to sit there with her on the second evening. Both of us quiet, both of us okay. Better than okay. The kind of okay that has weight to it, that you've earned. My wife always said the water had memory. She said if you sat beside it long enough, it would give you back the things you'd lost. I don't know if that's true, but I sat on that dock, and I thought about her, and I thought about the 3 years since she'd been gone, And I thought about how strange it was that the worst thing that happened to me in those years had also, in a roundabout way, given me back something I hadn't known I'd been losing. I had been drifting, letting other people set the terms of my life because it was easier than deciding for myself, letting grief make me passive. He had taken advantage of that, and I am not pretending that doesn't make me furious when I let myself think about it directly. But the fury, once it had somewhere to go to the detective's office, to the courtroom, to the judge's decision, had cleared out space for something else. I booked a trip to the East Coast this coming spring. Nova Scotia, then Prince Edward Island, then a few days in Cape Breton to see the Cabot Trail before the season turn. My wife always wanted to do that trip, and we kept saying next year, the way people do when they believe time is unlimited. It's not. I know that better than most people in my immediate circle, and I am done with next year. I want to say one more thing before I go. If you are listening to this, and something in it sounds familiar, not because you've heard this story, but because you recognize the feeling of it, the way someone can be close to you and looking at you and seeing something entirely different than what you think they see, please don't wait for the moment of certainty before the for when not, like tamed, you act. I waited because I wanted to be sure. I was lucky that waiting was an option for me, that the documentation came together before any real harm was done. Not everyone gets that kind of time. Trust the feeling. Talk to someone outside the situation, a professional, a friend with no stake in the outcome, someone who will tell you the truth because they have nothing to lose by doing so. Make the call that feels premature. Change the password that feels paranoid. Write things down. Keep records. The practical things are not unromantic. The practical things are how you survive. My accountant, my colleague, my lawyer, my daughter eventually. These are the people who got me through this. These are the people who showed up when the comfortable version of my life turned out to be a construction, and what was underneath it needed to be rebuilt from scratch. I am rebuilding. It is slower work than the demolition was, but I am standing in the middle of it, and the light is decent, and I know where the key to the safety deposit box is, and my daughter is coming for dinner on Sunday, and I am, in the end and against reasonable odds, still one of the lucky ones.